All right, welcome everybody. I'm Étienne Brown. I'm a news reporter at the Mercury News. I've been covering the technology industry here in Silicon Valley for about 8 years. I've learned a lot and at the same time know very little. But I'm very glad that we're here today talking about free speech and artificial intelligence. Because out there, it's getting pretty crazy. Just this week, there were Governor Gavin Newsom signed into law 3 bills to try to regulate election and political misinformation that's generated by AI. And he was inspired by a tweet from Elon Musk, the world's richest man. The world's richest man then said, this is just parody. And then yesterday, the guy who created the deep fake that Elon Musk had tweeted about Kamala Harris sued the state of California, echoing Musk's argument that this is all just parody, that parody is now being criminalized, and he cited the First Amendment, as might be expected. So using AI to create language and imagery and words, spoken words, can dramatically enhance people's ability to communicate for everyone from some random person on the internet to a mega billionaire to a recent president of the United States. And this technology is being deployed by an industry where disregarding the risk of collateral damage is part of the business model. And creating shareholder value has come to matter more than all else. Now, the big tech companies are racing each other and China to win the AI market. And they're erecting few guardrails, and they're fighting to keep any guardrails from being imposed on them. So historically, government has had a really hard time keeping up with the pace of technology and reining in companies when their behavior and their products start to do widespread harm. But with generative AI, we're seeing debate and pushback to a degree that we didn't see before with the rise of social media and pervasive digital surveillance and the destruction of the news media. And we're all here today because the deployment of generative AI has powerful implications for free speech. And AI in general has powerful implications for free speech. And we're going to hear about some of that today as well. So I'm looking forward to hearing from these expert folks about the issues of top concern and how we can preserve the open dialogue that's crucial to the health of our society, democracy, and economy, while limiting the fallout from damaging speech that's supercharged by this new technology. And so just to distinguish here, we're talking about generative AI, which is the AI that OpenAI sort of launched into the public realm a couple of years ago. It's become the next big thing for Silicon Valley. Everyone's jumping all over it. It allows you to create imagery and language and audible language, which can be used for deepfakes and such, and has been, as in the case of Elon Musk tweeting that Kamala Harris deepfake. And so, but there's also more traditional forms of AI that have been, in development and in use for years and years. And so, first, I'd just like to ask. So let me introduce everyone first. And so we've got Étienne Brown. He's at the end here, a professor of philosophy at San Jose State University. Femia, a lawyer at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Roxana Marachi, professor of education at San Jose State University here. And Drew Liebert, director of the California Initiative for Technology and Democracy. So first, we'll go to Roxana and ask her to tell us about what different kinds of AI are we talking about here that have implications for free speech?
Thank you so much. First of all, I want to thank the organizing team for inviting me to speak. It's an honor to be here. And I also we want to protect academic freedom of speech, but also academic freedom. So I have to do the disclaimer that my views today are mine and do not necessarily represent Connie Lurie College of Education, San Jose State University, or the California State University system. I'm glad that we started with, we need to differentiate the different kinds of AI, because what has ramped up in this last year, all the news has been about the generative AI, ChatGPT, and that's what's gotten a lot of the news. As you mentioned, there are different kinds of AI. I'm in education, and I have been following some very serious concerns around data extraction from cradle to career, literally, of children, and predictive analytics. The AI where there is an effort to take many different data points and to say this person is likely to succeed or not, or have some kind of health disability, whatever it may be. And I think that when we look at the companies, what they're doing, and the outsized influence and power that they have in shaping what we see on social media, what we believe to be true, we are in the middle of Silicon Valley, and these companies are shaping the language and the narratives that we use around AI. It's just really important to differentiate the different kinds of AI. If this is to be focused on generative AI, I think that it's going to be limited, and I hope that we can expand the conversation and concerns around the different kinds of AI, because many of the companies are marketing themselves as doing these, AI that is for the public good, AI for the social good, and we have to talk about these. This is an important part of the freedom of speech, and separating the corporate influence from independent research and academia.
Thank you. So we'll elaborate on that, on the different kinds of AI here with some of the answers to these questions. But so I just want to go along the panel here and ask everybody, what are the most important free speech concerns related to AI? And this can include the AI that's used for content moderation and such, and it can include generative AI or any other AI, because it's a big basket of very important stuff. So, Étienne, what's crucial here? What do we need to be thinking and talking about?
Yeah, is it okay if I also partly answer the last question? Because I think it's important. It's really important, and you're right to incite us to distinguish the different kinds of AI, right? So like I think that maybe a lot of you that were drawn to this panel are thinking about AI, or thinking about generative AI, right? So things like chatbots and ChatGPT and Claude, and also image generators. But there's really a kind of AI that we really have to zoom in if you're thinking about free speech on social media, and that's recommendation algorithms, right? So the algorithms that basically structure your social media feed, that make it that when you log in Facebook or Instagram or TikTok, there's an nearly unlimited set of items that you could be seeing, but you see one first, and then you see the second, and then you see the third and the 10th. These decisions are made by a recommendation algorithm, right? So they're the algorithms that basically allocate attention and contribute to what we can call the management of visibility online, right? They're also what determines, if you're a speaker, what's kind of the reach of your speech, right? Whether your speech is going to travel very, very, very well on social media platform or it won't be. And these have not been always around, right? There's a pre-recommendation algorithms social media world, but there's kind of a revolution that happens on social media when social media platforms move to an engagement optimization model. And instead of having these kind of chronological feed that relates to what Alex Stamos was saying on the last panel, you're presenting with content that is the most likely to kind of make you react, right? Any kind of reaction, because any kind of reaction makes you stay longer on the platform, and if you stay longer on the platform, you see more advertisement. If you see more advertisement, the companies are generating more revenues, right? So it is important to talk about Gen AI. I'm confident that we'll have the time to do it, but I really think that we should be paying attention to who gets to decide what those recommendation algorithms are, right? What are the goals of these recommendations algorithms, because they're what structure kind of our digital experience when it comes to online communication. And I really think that Alex Stamos is right to say that the central issue with online speech is not really expression, it's the allocation of attention. So it might be actually that we need a different kind of philosophical or normative conceptual framework to think about justice in that space. I don't think the First Amendment gives us everything we need, right? We need to think about who deserves attention, in which context, for which reason, etc. Sorry, I've been very long, and I want to let my colleagues answer, but I would say one question that relates to AI is who gets to control the recommendation algorithms that are implemented and structure our life when we interact on social media. I'll stop there.
Thanks. I want to ask you again about that issue as we go on. It's a very interesting and important point. Well, Lisa, top concerns. What should we be looking at and worrying about?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so many different issues that are going to come up here in this space. I do think something I'm curious to talk more about content moderation and algorithmic decision making, because I do think that's something that we're going to see come up increasingly, and I think the Supreme Court has signaled that it's interested in it. And it's sort of two recent cases. Especially one recent case on content moderation regulation, sort of referenced in concurrences, what about AI? So I think they've signaled that this is something we're going to see more of. But I think sort of the biggest, and this is very broad and we can, dig into it deeper, but the biggest First Amendment issue I see with this is there's going to be a rush, and there has been a rush to regulate AI and do it quickly, and that without understanding necessarily how the technology might evolve, where it's going, and how other existing laws might already help protect us from some of the harms that we're seeing. And in doing so, there is going to be potentially overbroad regulations passed that might limit more speech than we want to limit. And there's going to be litigation that follows. And this is just, I think the biggest area is watching broad AI regulations come down and how we're going to respond to them. So.
Thank you. Drew?
Wow. You can hear me okay, right? I spent 20 years working in the California legislature. It just started a nonprofit focusing on what the heck are we going to do about AI. So much is happening, we could spend the next 6 hours talking about this. Some of our opponents have actually been EFF. So what I want to start with is just some of the headlines that we're dealing with right now. Just yesterday, you probably saw Microsoft says Russian operatives are ramping up attacks on Harris campaign with fake videos. We know how those fake videos are created. That's AI. Thank you very much. I want to turn to a quote that I like very much, and it's actually 300 years old. And this is the quote. It's by a guy named Jonathan Swift. He said, "Falsehood flies and truth comes limping after it, so that when people come to be undeceived, it is too late. The jest is over, and the tale hath had its effect." I like to kind of bring people up to where the public is right now about AI, and where I think we all should be. According to a recent UC Berkeley, my alma mater, poll that was done, 84% of California voters expressed concern about the dangers that disinformation, deepfakes, and artificial intelligence pose to our upcoming elections. Well, I think we all should be really concerned about that. We all know this term, an October surprise. We're all watching and waiting to see what those surprises will look like with the advent of the AI age, right? And so we'll talk more about it, but we've been working hard in the legislature to try to develop some initial laws that somehow can balance these constraints between the First Amendment and our freedom of speech, but also protect us as voters. How are we supposed to decipher in real time the kinds of disinformation, which I think is a crazy term, right? It's really lies, right, about what's going on in our system. It's breaking apart our society, we know that. It's also threatening our elections and our democracy. So my message to all of us is, as we talk about the sanctity of the First Amendment, we have to be careful that in our quest to have maximum freedom of speech, we don't lose the very democracy that protects freedom of speech. We know there are people actually even running at the highest levels of our government who, if they have their way, will be the greatest threats to free speech and to our democracy. So I think that balancing act is one we have to be careful about, and I enjoy debates with my colleagues about the sanctity of the First Amendment, which I studied in law school, and the reality of this new age, this new incredible revolution of communication, where Elon Musk can send out a tweet that went to 800 million people that was a deep fake. That is a serious challenge to our society and our politics today. So much to be said about this. Thank you.
Thanks, Drew. Yeah, it is, and this is a perfect example of the balancing act. We're going to be sort of going through all these issues and hearing from the concerns and the threats on both sides, and while we also seem to be sort of hurtling down this slippery slope and toward a huge event coming November. With tremendous implications for our country. So thank you. And so Roxana, what concerns do you have about free speech and AI?
So many. I really appreciated the quote that you just mentioned, and it reminded me of the extent to which we are all susceptible to wanting to believe something, wanting to do good, and then being duped. Has anyone ever been the right? And I think that as academics and as folks who are in this space who want to do right by our communities, we have to really, really scrutinize not just what we see on social media, but the messaging that we're getting in our own institutions, with our own funding, with everything that is happening, because the folks that are driving those narratives also have profits to make by our work and our labor in this space. I read a really fascinating and troubling article. There's been two I wanted to share. One is, it's published by The Intercept. It's called The Invention of Ethical AI. And it's how big tech manipulates academia to avoid regulation. Now, this is not a comfortable article to bring up in the middle of, as an academic, right? But I've seen these patterns, and I see similar kinds of things. Part of this, that was folks who were within the MIT Media Lab who were involved in, ethical AI, doing all the things that we care about. We want to make sure that these things are going to be rolling out. We want to do it right. There's a partnership on AI to benefit people in society. This sounds like a wonderful thing, right? And what ended up happening is that there was an effort to have the academics sign on to legislative efforts to do advocacy, but it was driven by the narratives of the corporate interests. It was going to be, without the guardrails that are really necessary. So I just think it's really important that we pay attention to who is profiting. As Étienne said, who's making the decisions about who has the voice. One of the things I think is really important to bring to this conversation is a long view, a generational perspective. We're all adults. We have the luxury and the privilege of having had a childhood without our data having been collected and tracked from the time that we were very young. Right now, the new generation, the babies that are born today, the babies that are going to be born in the next generation, are growing into a world where there is day-to-day tracking of everything that they're doing in school, what they're doing on social media. There's a great book by Anita Farahani called The Battle for Our Brains. There's sensing technologies trying to read our thoughts. This is a very serious issue. And so as we talk about freedom of speech, freedom of expression, academic freedom, and the ability to challenge and question what we are doing for the public good, for genuinely the public good and not for the corporate, profits, we really have to think carefully about the next generation and the way that they are being ensnared and pulled, and the data that's being extracted from them in these predictive algorithms to try to say who is a risk, whose voices should be amplified, whose voices should be throttled in the social media space. This is going to happen for our next generation unless we put some guardrails around the data collection and trafficking of the data of our young children. I think it's almost like, I don't want to say it's a lost cause for us adults, but I think it's just much more important as we look at the long view to take a developmental perspective on this and to really think of the next generations.
Roxana, yeah, it's the companies that are developing and marketing these technologies. Have a long history of working at every level to avoid being, reined in any way. And there was a lot of talk as AI started to gain a higher profile. These companies were saying, we need regulation, and there were theories that they just think they'll come out on top. They'll be able to handle the regulation better than, it'll quash startups and all that. But then when regulation sort of starts to rear up, they push back as hard as they can.
Can I add one thing?
Yes.
To it? I know I spoke at length, but
Yeah,
would
no,
it be
please,
okay?
go ahead.
I think that it's also, we need to also get out of the conversation about just AI. That's the hot topic right now. What's coming around the bend? Emerging technologies. We need to look at the convergence of AI, blockchain, Internet of Things, and all of these things that are going to be promised to us as solutions to the privacy issues and all the freedom of speech issues. So I just think that having a lens on what's being pitched to me as a solution and having a critical thinking lens, is this actually going to benefit the public, or is it going to benefit the investors or the companies that are saying we're going to do this ethically? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And also, with regard to the regulation, I'm looking forward to hearing from Lisa about the risks associated with overregulation of this technology, and certainly, pointing to China as another actor that is going to not impose any restrictions that potentially could be imposed on American corporations. That's a legitimate concern also. So I'm interested to hear about that. And so, but if we now go to weaponization. So we're talking with weaponization mostly about the generative AI, and so how can we prevent AI from being weaponized to spread disinformation and hate, and to undermine our democracy? And so let me first go to Drew, and then I want to ask you, the others of you as well, about how to do that in a way that is effective and yet preserves free speech and doesn't harm the things we're trying to protect. Drew,
Okay.
please.
Just a small topic, right? How can we prevent AI from being weaponized? Well, the first thing I say about that is Congress has to change Section 230. And for those of you who might not know about Section 230, it's essentially this kind of unprecedented shield that Congress gave the platforms at the federal level when the internet was just evolving, because understandably, it was well-intentioned. We didn't want the platforms and the internet to be so suppressed with lawsuits and attacks by content that was placed on them. We wanted to have a free speech kind of environment. But we all know that over these years, the courts have interpreted Section 230 incredibly robustly. In fact, I'm kind of excited to say, and I'm looking forward to having a conversation with Lisa about this, that the Third Circuit District Court of Appeal just came down with a really important case regarding Section 230 that essentially says, hey, hold on, let's take a look at the real world here. And that is in this really, if you read the facts of this case, they're stunning, right? A 10-year-old girl strangled herself when TikTok algorithmically encouraged her to try this choking exercise that she could then show her friends. And unfortunately, it led to her death. And the parents ended up suing TikTok, and the Third Circuit has just held that basically under those circumstances, we're not going to just throw this case out under Section 230, that in fact the court said, and this is really important, that in TikTok's algorithm, Étienne, in its algorithm putting out this content to this young child, it was actually a speaker. It was actually therefore engaging in its own First Amendment speech and would not be protected as simply a bulletin board of the old ways that we looked at these platforms. So my first suggestion is we've got to change Section 230 to make clear that these social media and other platforms have some form of accountability for the harms that they cause our children and all of us. They shouldn't be having this unprecedented shield that allows the tech titans in this country to decide themselves what types of potentially harmful content that can harm lots of people, including our democracy, should be allowed on their sites. The second thing I would do.
Drew, let me just stop
Yeah.
you there, and we'll get
Yeah.
back to the
Okay.
second and other
Sure.
things as you wish. But I want to ask Lisa right now, because I suspect that you disagree about
Excellent.
changing Section 230. And so if you could address that and explain your thoughts about that.
Yeah, of course. So I understand the criticisms of Section 230, and we do see, a lot of people encounter harmful content online, and there is disinformation, there is, offensive hate speech, and this is all something that you can find on the internet. And there's a real appetite to hold platforms accountable for hosting that speech in an effort to protect people. But I think that it is actually, that would be a really sort of heavy-handed tool that would not be narrowly targeting what the actual issue is. And you have to understand, when you hold platforms liable for hosting this speech, you're going to lead to extreme over-censorship of anything that might get them in trouble with the law. I mean, these big companies, they're going to avoid, liability and the extreme costs and burdens of litigation, are just going to lean into over-censoring any content that might cause them to be taken to court. And content moderation is really hard. And I think anyone who has been just a moderator on even a small forum has found that making decisions about what does or does not meet your standards or guidelines can be difficult at a small scale. Say, a harassment policy. You draw a line somewhere and suddenly you find out, actually, well, someone that didn't quite meet that still hurt someone else's feelings. And it's just, line drawing there is really, really difficult. And when you take it at a big scale, and the way that these big tech companies have to, of course, there's going to be things that slip through. There's going to be things that don't go quite right. But when you then tell them that they're going to be liable for those mistakes, for those things that come through, you're going to lead to an internet that just has far less information, far less speech, and far less ability for you to share your thoughts and to access speech. And I think that the other thing you have to keep in mind is that content moderation is really expensive. And so what's going to happen is that you're going to concentrate even more online speech in the biggest tech actors, because they're the ones that are going to be able to afford a massive content moderation team. And smaller platforms are going to end up having to shut down or host very limited speech in order to avoid liability.
I mean, do we then have to accept the collateral damage, like a little girl is going to die because the systems are too big to properly police?
So, I mean, you can still hold speakers who speak on the platforms accountable for the stuff that, if it is something that is a directly actionable speech, you can hold the speaker accountable without holding a platform accountable. And I think that there's always trade-offs, and the risk of shutting down lots of speech and discourse online is a huge risk, and not something that we should take lightly in the name of sort of protecting I think there's a lot of good that happens from online discourse that would be undermined, and that shouldn't be taken lightly in this conversation.
Étienne, algorithms speaking, is this a necessary reality of social media, that there's no real economic way to ensure that the harm doesn't get done? I mean, and could you talk about when the algorithm is recommending something that's potentially harmful to people, is that something that needs to be regulated? Is that something that companies should be paying more attention to? How do we limit the harm of recommendation algorithms? Because we've seen over and over again that there's all kinds of stuff that gets recommended to young people that's not good for them. So are there solutions to this?
Yeah, I'll try to. That's a challenge, but I'll try to answer the previous question and that question at the same time. So I tend to think a bit like Roxana. I think that sometimes the role of academics is to shift the focus a little bit, and I think that we're actually paying too much attention to Section 240 and not enough to other things. I feel I'm somewhere between Lisa and Drew. I'm not as optimistic as some can be that if you just repeal 230, then suddenly that's the magical piece missing, and then social media platforms are going to start moderating more. There's also some possible negative side effects of repealing 230. One that would happen is that platforms would be liable liable to defamation lawsuit and would have all kind of perverse incentive to take down what I'm inclined to say good speech, right? Like think about Me Too, right? Like people on social media calling out sexual harasser. Imagine like you don't have Section 230 and then you have like Facebook or Meta being like, okay, that's potentially defamation. That person is being called a sexual harasser. Let's take down the speech, right? Like you don't want that to happen. For instance, there's also some like very powerful media organizations that are not covered by 230 that engage in misinformation, like Fox News does so all the time, right? So I really don't think that repealing 230 is a magic bullet. What I do think we need to do is pay more attention to specific moderation policies and of the actual efforts that are deployed by big tech corporations to enforce them, right? So if you have reasons to believe that there's a tech company that's not really doing enough to take down hate speech, you need a hate speech law, of course, to do that, or that's not taking down the content that Drew is concerned about and is right to be concerned about, right? Content that encourages self-harm. I think we should debate individual moderation policies more and the efforts that have been put into place by tech companies to enforce those moderation. Like I've seen some people working in the moderation space, and I think Lisa is right. It's like it's not that simple to moderate, right? And sometimes companies fail not because they're not trying, just because it's extremely complicated. Last thing to answer the second part of your question, and I'll let my colleagues chime in, is that we need to think seriously about way to like basically think about the economic model and the perverse incentives. I think the one thing that you can do that is to think creatively about who gets to decide what algorithms are put into place. Like, some philosophers and political theorists are thinking like we'll need something like, boards of citizens, right? That would be have some sort of decisional power within big corporations when it comes to which algorithms are gonna distribute content and things like that. That's a difficult idea to put into place, right? To limit the power of the board of a company and to give back power to some citizens. But I think that like it is the responsibility of philosophers and political theorists to think about things like that. It has nothing to do with 230, right? But it's one way in which you can like take back some power and modify the economic incentive. If you have like an intermediary body that's allowed to tell a board, no, sorry, you can't just maximize engagement because we know that it's having really bad effects on a democracy like that. So, yeah, I'll stop.
Yeah, that's a very interesting idea, and I know that both Roxana and Drew have thoughts on this. So let's start with Roxana, and then we'll go to Drew.
Thank you. So I think again, one of the challenges is that the technology is moving faster than the regulation. It's often been said, that the toothpaste is out of the tube, the train has left the station, it's too late. We can clean up the toothpaste, we can stop the train. There are things that we can do to protect the public, and I think that one of the concerns. Oh my gosh, I lost my train of thought. Please go ahead.
Okay,
and I'll
well,
come back to it.
I'm happy to jump in because I wasn't saying to get rid of 230.
Yeah.
I was saying to reform 230. The second thing I want to tell you is I think you were a little bit too cavalier, forgive me, when you said, there will be collateral damage. In this case, this 10-year-old girl, you said that it was merely, that the platform was simply hosting it. No. What was the platform doing? It was using an algorithm that tracked all of her personal information, including her age, by the way, to know that she would find this to be very interesting. And so it's really deceptive, I think, to say all these platforms are doing are hosting information for us to look at. They are actually deciding, just as you said, Étienne, what do you see? In this case, Nyla, who ultimately was killed, right? Nyla was served up by TikTok a specific recipe, and that recipe led to her death. So I ask you, should in that kind of circumstance, a platform be held somehow responsible, accountable? It's not that we want lots of lawsuits. We actually want these platforms to be civically responsible. And guess what's happened in the last 3 years? You know this. Most of the major platforms have dramatically, right, Étienne? They have cut back dramatically their content moderation teams. We had on our board at Cited a former leader of the content team at Twitter who was let go, as we know. And Twitter now basically has this so-called free space place, But guess who has the greatest freedom of all? The owner of Twitter, to text out whatever he wants and to decide what it is that all the people who use Twitter, which I don't, all the people who use Twitter get to see. I think we can't be purists about this stuff anymore. It's going too fast, just as you say, and we need very strong social action now together. The people want it. The polls show it, that people are scared about what these impacts are going to be on our society. We already know the dysfunction. We already know what's going on in our society and what's going on in our politics. So we got to take this stuff a little less purely and a little more seriously, I believe.
The safety.
Go back to Lisa for a second to respond to the idea of holding the companies responsible for, and we're not just talking about the recommendation, we're talking about the tracking and targeting too, because this is all, as Drew pointed out, this is a whole package. And the way this girl died was basically a result of how these companies operate and how they gain and hold attention and how they sell ads. So like their business model and the way they make billions and billions of dollars in profits depends on tracking children, targeting them with content. And so what Drew is saying is that somebody's got to hold these companies responsible. But you're pointing out that there are the likely response is to clamp down on speech and communication in ways that would perhaps be damaging. So like, what do we do? And we're going to go back to Roxana because I know you remembered what you wanted to say, but I just wanted to give you a chance to respond to what Drew said.
Yeah. No, and I mean, I agree. This is very real and very dangerous harm, and we don't want this. I think that looking just at Section 230 is just not the right tool, and we have other tools that were, like, I think comprehensive consumer privacy law, which we do not have in this country, would help protect against a lot of this. A lot of what we're seeing that we really don't like online comes from the fact that we're being, as you mentioned, just like endlessly tracked. Every mouse click is sending information, not just to the website you're on, but to third-party behavioral tracking, your data brokers. There's an entire industry out there that is just collecting data about us every time we go online. And then the platforms are using this and the other websites are using this to then target and feed you content and feed kids content that is, supposed to keep them on, keep them clicking. And I think more comprehensive consumer privacy would be a way to reduce this type of thing without then also running the risk of opening platforms up to so many, say, defamation lawsuits that they end up restricting speech. And I think the other area that you could look at in order to help protect people online is competition. And right now, there's really big tech monopolies, and only in the last couple years have we had an FTC that's been interested in doing anything about this. And so there's no real user choice when it comes to tech platforms. And that they, in turn, don't really have any incentive to keep their users as safe. So I think that there's just other areas of the law that could use a lot of improvement and are areas we could go through to keep people safe online that don't run the same risks of then suppressing a lot of really important and legal speech.
Thank you. Roxana?
Thank you. So what I was going to be saying was that it's important to uphold AI safety standards in the same way that in engineering, when you build a bridge, there have been safety standards set that are based in physics, that are based in like what we know about what's going to be a structurally strong bridge. Those safety standards, we don't have that yet, that I think is industry free. Right? And I think that right now what's happening is that we have companies that are saying, we're going to build a bridge for you. It's going to have innovative materials. It's lighter, it's stronger, it's more durable, it's more flexible, et cetera. And then the bridge is built and then it fails. And then it's too late. And so how do we go back to actual safety standards that is going to hold the bridge developers accountable, that is going to hold the materials company that sold you that bridge accountable? It's a similar kind of thing. It's a different example, but I think there are some parallels to be made. And to ensure that in the same way that we have product safety guidelines, we want to ensure that whatever is going out, Consumer Protection Agency, right, is not going to harm the public. We need to do the same for the platforms. And again, with non-corporate funded research.
Thank you. So, and now if we, so we're talking about a technology that has, it has the ability to do things that, that other technologies have not been able to do in the past. It can do calculations that humans could never even think of doing on their own. It has these tremendous powers, and we're talking about all the downsides. But so is there a way to use AI, to use this technology to combat the problems that arise from the widespread use of AI for non-constructive purposes? And so, is this a technology that can cut both ways? Like, can we harness this to rein it in? Is that possible, Étienne?
Yeah. It's always so hard because you ask such good questions, but then my colleagues have just said some good things that it's hard for me not to react, because there's a lot of agreement that I have actually with Drew, and I really don't want to give the impression that I'm saying, because I'm not convinced by reforming 230 that we shouldn't regulate those companies. Like, quite the contrary. I think the core normative agreement is that engagement optimization is doing serious damage to young users, to adult users, to the democracy. So I think that's where we have to focus our attention, right, to make it so that that model cannot happen. But to answer the question of our moderator, yes, I do think that AI has a role to play in content moderation. It is already playing an important role in content moderation, right? Like, there's some researchers at San Jose State University, like Bryce Westlake, who's working on an AI system that detects child pornography very quickly. So I do think that AI should be used by social media platforms to moderate. It can do things like, we also think of content moderation like reviewing content a lot, and there's a lot of that, but there's a whole side of content moderation that has nothing to do about content review. It's about what tech companies call behavioral indicators. So let us say I create 1,000 accounts from one IP address, right? Someone can detect that, it's fishy, they're probably gonna take down my account. It has nothing to do about content. Like, regardless of the content that I post, AI can possibly do that, right? Monitor some kind of like behavioral indicators and be like, this looks like a foreign influence campaign. We should probably suspend that account. Reviewing images for child pornography and things like that. I'm a little bit less optimistic, although, maybe some AI tech enthusiasts in the room are going to prove me wrong, that AI is going to do miracles with content review, because the truth is that hate speech and misinformation is often phrased in very, very ambiguous language. The message that is kind of transmitted by an individual piece of content often varies by national context, right? Like, if you want to spot hate speech and misinformation in Turkey or in Myanmar, you need to know this political context very, very well to be able to say, like, oh yeah, that metaphor is actually hateful. Like, I don't know, right? And a lot of moderators don't know. Could AI do that? I'm not sure. Like, I think it's very, very hard. Ambiguous language poses some serious challenges for human moderators, and probably they will also for AI moderators, because finding the intent behind post is something that's very hard to do. So yeah, let's not say AI is just evil. Let's never use it. It has its roles to play in moderation. Let's be careful about our enthusiasm. I don't like making predictions about AI. It's very hard when you're a tech ethicist because everyone's making predictions around you. But I'm not going to make predictions. I'll just express some grounds for skepticism.
Thank you. Roxana, did you have something you wanted to say on that?
I just think that there are some invisible risks to the algorithmic content moderation. Some of what I'm concerned about is the false targeting of youth for their speech. They're young, they're exploring, they're posting things, that when they're 12 or 13, right, that could come back to haunt them later, right? And if you can never delete it, it's really problematic. So that's another issue. But one of the things around the algorithmic content moderation is, once it goes into a computer program that is programmed with, here's the language that we're going to deem violent or harmful or risky. So for example, kids want to play basketball and they say, oh, I'm going to go shoot some hoops, right? Or, oh, look, those shoes are the bomb. Like they're going to say something that's kind of youth language. This is the way that they speak, right? And now it gets flagged. They're talking about cool shoes, or they're talking about basketball, but because the language is programmed to flag this person, flag this content as potentially violent, potentially social, whatever it may be. Now that youth is targeted. They can no longer, and this has happened before. And so I just think that we really have to ask the questions of how are these algorithms being programmed? What are the unintended consequences? I have often referred to this moment that we're in right now as the challenger moment in AI. Many of you may remember in the 1980s, middle 1980s, 85, 86, I think it was, the Challenger was the space shuttle launch, right? The safety engineers clearly spoke out and said, this is not ready to launch. This is not going to be safe. But the momentum and the excitement and but the show has to go on overrode the safety engineers who said this should not be deployed, this should not be launching, and it ended in tragedy. I think we're in a similar kind of a moment with AI, that these platforms should not be, launching, they use military language, deploying these tools until they have been safety tested, that they have shown not to be harmful. They have been shown not to harm our most vulnerable communities, which right now we have every evidence that these tools are doing the greatest harm to our most marginalized communities.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, that really highlights, the problem of the size of these social media companies, the problem of moderating at that kind of scale. And when you talk about inflammatory hate speech, Facebook did a very poor job of moderating speech leading up to the genocide in Myanmar. There have been similar problems around the world, in Kenya, Ethiopia, where there hasn't been enough moderation to keep the inflammatory language from provoking people into acts of extreme violence against others in their country. So it's very interesting to hear. AI can it can accelerate our ability to do a lot of things, including moderate content. But whether it can do an effective job is another question. Let me ask Drew for his thoughts on that, and then I want to talk about hate speech too.
Okay.
But so, Drew, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm going to give you something optimistic for a change. And that is, content moderation isn't so hard to do. You know how we know that? Because the platforms themselves were the ones who developed content moderation. And in fact, if we look back, I think it was in the 2020 presidential campaign, Meta and others did a pretty good job after the disaster of the 2016 campaign, when the Russians did a very fine job of manipulating lots of people. And we had much less than was anticipated of disinformation in the 2020 election. And it was because we had these very large content moderation teams that were put up by the major platforms. And I have to congratulate those platforms who committed those incredible resources to do that. And that's what they should still be doing. But it became politically untenable, they felt, because one party felt that they were getting a lot of censorship through content moderation. We can't give up on content moderation, because what that's about is saying that these companies actually have a civic duty, not a legal one, but a civic duty to care about the degree of lies and manipulation that are occurring on their sites, particularly when it comes to protecting our society and our democracy. That's the first point I'd like to make. The second one is that we have to recognize how the internet evolved. It is essentially an advertising platform. That's how these companies live. So when we get too optimistic about AI being a solution and that they want to have change, in fact, Elon Musk said recently, AI is a rare case where I think we need to be proactive in regulation instead of reactive. So I want to ask you something. When you work in the legislature like I do you think that those tech companies are working hard to help us regulate AI and social media? Those are our opponents. They are not seeking regulation. They say a good game. But I can tell you that those companies have very powerful folks who are out there trying to prevent regulation. And so I think we have to call it as we see it. And the reality is that the economic model of AI is so powerful. In fact, Time magazine wrote recently, if I can find it, that the AI arms race appeared to catch even the tech companies off guard. Microsoft and Google shifted their entire corporate strategies in order to seize control of what they believe will become a new infrastructure layer of the economy. Google declared, as we all know, a code red corporate emergency in response to the success of ChatGPT and rushed its own search-oriented chatbot Bard. We know how that went. So the arms race is there, and that's very powerful economically. So if we think that these companies have the economic incentive to be as careful as they should be, not to let the challenger go up, that may not be reasonable to expect them to do that under the models that they work under.
If you want to say something, Roxana, briefly, we're
Absolutely.
going to go to questions soon, and I wanted to address the hate
these
speech.
These tech companies also, once they make their profits, they put those profits into foundations, tech-mediated foundations that then fund a lot of the research that's being done, that's invested in. These foundations are also invested in many of the companies that are going to be benefiting from these things. One of the important things to pay attention to, which is also invisible and under the radar, is the privatization of our public systems. These companies are tethering to and latching onto our public databases and systems, and then directing the ways that we spend our public dollars. So I often say it's dollars, it's democracy, and it's data. Once you have a public-private partnership, you have they are influencing legislation for social impact finance and all kinds of things where we're going to funnel our public tax dollars to partner with a private agency, a nonprofit that's not beholden to the public's interest, that can be put behind closed doors, their data practices, their data sharing and everything. And I think this is another threat to democracy and to free speech, because it's moving our voice from folks who are representing the public, taxpayers, the public interest, into a corporate narrative about public and social good.
So speaking of code red, so the AI has really dramatically changed communication, and it's really supercharged the ability of people to communicate hate speech. And there are other countries that have hate speech laws, and we have AI that's there's this statement that the presidential candidate made about immigrants eating pets. AI was used to accelerate that narrative with imagery, showing the candidate Trump holding a duck and a kitten, and so this increases the power of hate speech. And so, do we need a hate speech law in this country because AI has pushed us into a code red situation where hate could be much more pervasive and transmissible? And we'll go to Lisa first.
So yeah, I agree that AI has made it possible to sort of communicate more. It's expanded our abilities to communicate hateful speech online, but you have to remember this was happening before AI, and a hate speech law I would be strongly opposed to, because you have the government defining what hate is, and you have to then trust that your government is going to do so in a way that is not discriminatory towards certain populations. And you think about, some of even, this is obviously not government, but say Elon Musk, who we keep talking about, has made cisgender a slur on Twitter. And if you get people in Congress who agree with stuff, anti LGBTQ content, speech could be, pro LGBTQ speech could be hate speech, or we've got supporting various different foreign governments or political movements. It would be very, very easy for a government to then define hate speech in a way that would prevent very legitimate political speech, political opposition, and prevent people from speaking out from disfavored minorities. And I think a hate speech law is really dangerous because of that. And there are, other ways to go about this. So.
And anybody else want to, what's the solution? Étienne, stopping AI-charged hate, what do we do?
so many things to say. I'm more sympathetic. I think that I don't know where Drew and Roxana spent on this. I'm more sympathetic to a hate speech law, and I think again, like here we need to broaden our perspective a little bit. Like in the American context, hate speech laws got very, very bad press. But if you look at the European context, there are some countries that have implemented some hate speech laws, and democracy is not crumbling. Right? In Germany, you cannot make the Nazi salute in a public space. That's hate speech, right? In Germany, you cannot deny that the Holocaust happened. That's hate speech. Democracy in Germany is doing pretty well. So I actually think that, like, we're not going to go back to 230, you know, but I actually think that implementing a hate speech law might be a better incentive for social media companies to take down some kinds of content that we think is problematic, right? So yeah, it depends on the hate speech law, but I don't think we should too quickly jump to the position according to which hate speech laws are going to seriously create kind of a chilling effect or something like that. The last thing I want to say, if you allow me, is just because I feel there's an interesting disagreement or debate that I have or that we have with Drew. And there's some things I really agree with him. Like, it depends what you mean when you say content moderation is easy. Is setting up, allocating sufficient resources within your company to create a robust moderation program. That's relatively easy. It's an economical decision, right? Once you've done that, the work of people who write moderation policies and of moderators is not easy. It's extremely hard sometimes to decide, does this count as hate speech? Does this count as misinformation? But like the last thing I want to do today is to defend Elon Musk, right? Like taking down his moderation operation at Twitter was stupid, it was irresponsible, and it was ultimately a bad business decision. You can quote me on that. I don't care. Like, so we really agree about this.
So what I'd like to mention is when we worry about, is this turned on? Sorry. Right now, we leave it up to Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and the owners of these companies to decide what is hate speech. That's what that's what we're doing. Now, I don't think the answer is that hate speech statutes will solve this problem either, right? I recognize that. Obviously, there isn't going to be a silver bullet, I think, as maybe Lisa mentioned. But we have to think about all these things because we know it's not working right now. Right now, some of the biggest purveyors of hate speech are those who own the platforms. Now, that's a problem for a society, is it not? We need to do something about that, right? Are they the ones whose own political views and own values should determine what literally millions and even billions of people in this world are being exposed to? Are they the ones who should determine what those algorithms do? So I would say to Lisa, I totally get your concern about the fear that Congress or the state legislatures are going to come up with hate speech statutes that are actually designed to penalize those who are supportive of LGBTQ. But I can tell you that in my experience, in my life experience, that's highly unlikely. What's more likely is that the tech industry will prevent any type of action in these governmental bodies. They've been very successful in Congress to prevent, as you know, anything from happening. Probably will continue to do so. And meanwhile, we all know the story of social media. How did that work out, right? We're all now thinking, oh my gosh, what's happening with our kids, right? They're addicted on their cell phones, etc. I think it's really a difficult challenge for us, but we have to somehow recognize that we can't be purists on these issues anymore. Things are happening too fast, the technology's changing too fast, and the economic model of how these companies understandably are expected to make money prevent them from doing the right thing.
Let me just interject here, and if we look out at our country and various states, we can see that there are some really extreme politics happening, and so to Lisa's point that a hate speech law, the effects of that would vary by whoever is wielding it, and so if you have a state that is pushed back against critical race theory. You have national politicians who are pushing back against critical race theory. Teaching about slavery could you could get potentially prosecuted for hate speech. So like this is not a simple solution, but it's also true that that in Canada also, they've got a hate speech law. It's the same things. You can't do the Nazi salute. You can't attack people on the basis of race, and it has worked. It looks like they may end up with a very extreme national leadership soon, and so that'll be an interesting experiment there. But so all these issues are so thorny, and potential solutions are so problematic that I think it's really important to have these discussions. And this has been extremely helpful for me in looking at this from a whole bunch of different directions and considering issues that arise in very many fields from all of this and parts of our society and economy. So I think, Roxana, you wanted to say something else.
Just want to complicate that last issue a bit, because the hate speech, there's the content and then there's the person who's posting. And so do you limit the content, or do you say this person is to be silenced, right? So there's two issues there. But one other aspect of public free speech on the internet is that people can change their minds, right? Something you posted 5 years ago, you may not might be deemed hate speech, right, by whoever, but we can change our minds. And so to what extent then do any new restrictions or regulations then ensnare people from years past when they had thought something and then now they have a different view? So how do we grapple with the freedom to change your mind and free expression with a changed perspective? I think about the youth right now. They're swept up in these algorithms. They want to do what's right. They get caught up in social media and they post something, and then they don't realize that several years later, oh wow, this is not something that I wanted to be part of. And so how do we then address those issues of free speech and then not having what you've done, tag you for life?
Thank you. I just want to make sure that, does anybody out there have any questions? Ma'am.
Could you repeat the question? And then for the rest of the questions, we actually have a Q&A we've been collecting, and we'll read them. But I think most of the audience could not hear that question. So if I could ask our moderator to repeat it.
Yeah, well, would you just repeat the last part of that, please? Like, you're talking about a multidisciplinary panel that these companies would have to impose to aid in content moderation. Is that?
Yes, I'm wondering, just from the constitutional analysis with the free speech issue, what is the important government interest that is served through recalcitrance or cowardice, maybe to not step in and do the hard work instead of stepping back and not wanting regulation?
Answer, and there's a less cynical answer, right? Like, the cynical answer has to do with the reality of how democracy is conducted and what kind of voters you need to convince to get reelected and which donors you need to convince to make sure that you have enough money for your campaign. So I think that we need to think about this, right? Like, I'm going to try not to be too controversial. When I see some pretty prominent politicians in Silicon Valley and San Francisco oppose Bill 1047, which is about regulating AI to make sure that there's independent safety reviews, and when you have politicians coming out against it, you can't help but worry, like, are they doing that because if they don't, they're afraid they're not going to be reelected because there's a lot of pro-tech people in the region. So that's the cynical answer. The less cynical answer is that I do understand, I'm not a libertarian, but I do understand the worry about giving too much power to the government to regulate the public sphere, right? Like what you want to do, and that's extremely hard to do. I'm a philosopher, I think everything's hard, but like what is very hard to do is that you want to avoid the situation or the problem that Drew has eloquently described. I agree with 100% of his last intervention when he says you do not want big corporations that have a for-profit incentive deciding what kind of digital public sphere we're going to interact with as democratic citizens. They are not going to take decisions that goes in the interest of the public good. He's right about this. And then some people are going to say, you also don't want the government to have control of what kind of message circulate in the public sphere, because we know what kind of dangers that create, right? Like, and then you have this entire, for instance, think about the whole discourse about repealing 230, again, 230, but there's a certain kind of conservative discourse that says that the reason why we need, or they're not going to say it like that, but that's what they mean, we should repeal 230 so that we're going to accuse social media platforms of being too liberal, and then if they don't have immunity or liability, then maybe we're going to hear more conservative voices. That kind of discourse has kind of died down since Musk took over Twitter, because no one can reasonably deny that now that the right has a platform embodied in the person of Elon Musk. But what you want to do is to protect what we can call the autonomy of the public sphere, right? You want the public sphere to be shielded from elites, economic elites, and also shielded from abuses of governmental power. But that's extremely difficult to do, right? How do you preserve the autonomy of the public sphere? That's why I was going to things like, well, maybe we need like boards of citizens, right? You want to give power to someone that's not trying to convince donors to get reelected or that has a clear political agenda. And you also don't want to give too much power to corporations that are seeking profit, right? But the non-cynical answer is actually crafting good legislation in a democracy is very hard to do, right? So sometimes I think there's perverse incentives, but some things I also think that there's legitimate worry by people who are reluctant to implement. And that's, that's kind of the perspective that Lisa, in a way, echoes, right? Like, careful with legislation. You need to be sure that's really well tailored, because it might backfire, right? I'm not unsympathetic to that discourse, honestly.
Roxana?
So thank you for the question. It's a really great one. I want to cite a really interesting article by the Revolving Door Project. And the title is, "The Scandal-Plagued Software Company Has Hired a Trio of Capitol Hill Insiders to Fend Off Regulatory Scrutiny from Congress." And I think what we need is to have investigative reporting like this to look at the conflicts of interest related to legislators who would be silencing kind of, any kind of legislation that would be for the general public good. This revolving door project scrutinizes the executive branch appointees to ensure they use their office to serve the broad public interest rather than to entrench corporate power or seek personal advancement. The reason this is important, this is a local example that I actually want to bring up. Many of you, if you're following San Jose City Council, kind of some what's going on, and nationally, this is a national issue, there's a company called RealPage that is under scrutiny right now and investigation for algorithmic rent price fixing. So to connect back to Dr. Russell's opening remarks about the cost of housing and how here we are in Silicon Valley and the highest rates of housing insecurity and everything. And so when you have lobbyists, so this is this revolving door of lobbyists and the private equity firm that would be, profiting from these things, who are legislative staffers for the folks who would be doing, the regulation on these things, we really have to pay attention to the money that's going to those folks that are making the decisions, and to ensure that that is free of conflicts of interest. To bring it full circle to the massive amounts of data, all different kinds of data that are being gathered from these companies. That same RealPage is owned by a private equity firm called Thoma Bravo. Thoma Bravo purchased Instructure, Canvas, learning management system 2 years ago for $2 billion, and they're selling it now for $4.8 billion to another private equity firm. This is the same private equity firm that owns our health data. And so I really appreciate the question, because it is extremely important that we put some really strong, legitimate guardrails, and that our legislators are not beholden to corporate interests or lobbyists who are going through these revolving doors to try to side with the corporate interest rather than serving the people. Thank you.
There's not another question out there that, do we have one? I
Yes.
want to make sure we give a chance to people there.
So our next question is, Elon Musk fakes Twitter come up, but institutions like San Jose State and the government still use questionable platforms, adding content for its benefit. When does the good sign off at risk of invisibility?
So could you say that again, please?
Yes. So the question is, Elon Musk fakes Twitter come up, but institutions like San Jose State and governments and institutions still use questionable platforms, adding content for its benefit. When does the good sign off at risk of invisibility?
Okay, so should institutions be taking the high road and sort of stopping using platforms that have shown themselves to be destructive? Do I have that in certain ways? And if someone does something egregious like owning a platform and spreading disinformation, fake information, should that provoke public institutions of learning to pull back from these? And maybe they'd set an example. I don't know who would like to address that.
I've got another question I'd answer.
Okay, well, I'll say that's a very good question that everybody, I think, who thinks about this stuff struggles with on an individual basis. And as a Twitter user, I probably several times a week see someone saying, "That's it." There's too much hate on this platform. There's too much misinformation, or that guy that owns this place is tweeting stuff that I disagree with so profoundly that I'm leaving. So that's a very interesting question that's happening individually, and probably should be something that institutions think about, because institutional eyeballs are also supporting this digital advertising ecosystem that is funding this stuff. So great question. And Drew, what was it that you wanted to address?
Well, first of all, I want to acknowledge that I truly understand the challenges that the campaign finance system imposes on politicians in office. It's enormous. We obviously, as a society, should deal with that reality. Many people don't really understand it that well, but it's a very corrosive process, right? The thing that I'd like to mention is I'd like to pick on another branch of government, one that I didn't work in, and that is the judiciary. And that is that I think it's absolutely time for us to have a new approach to jurisprudence about First Amendment law that brings it up to the 21st century, that acknowledges that we're no longer talking about someone yelling fire in a theater. We're talking about someone being able to post something that's incredibly dangerous. For example, showing the Pentagon having been bombed and watching the United States stock market go down $1 trillion until it's revealed that it was a fake. The communication mechanisms that we face in our society now are so fundamentally different, and our courts have not yet caught up in their First Amendment jurisprudence. The First Amendment is not absolute. I'll just remind you that advertising can be regulated to prevent fraud, slander, libel, blackmail, and obscenity. And I think it's really time for our courts to catch up, just as the Third Circuit did in this case about social media amplifying dangerous information that can cause a little girl to kill herself, that we have to have that branch of government catching up to the 21st century as well.
I'll just add one. I mean, I agree and don't agree, but I do agree. There, as you mentioned, there are exceptions to the First Amendment. It's not absolute, and I do think that one area that we could really look at is strengthening some of those existing exceptions to the First Amendment, like fraud, like defamation, because there's already decades and decades of jurisprudence on balancing First Amendment rights against those harms. And so instead of reinventing the wheel with entirely new regulation, we could look at strengthening those existing exceptions to the First Amendment in order to help with like deep fakes.
Can I just say something?
Yes, please.
I agree with Drew's fundamental intuition here, and there's an influential essay published by a professor of law at Columbia called Tim Wu, who wrote an essay called "Is the First Amendment Obsolete?" And the basic idea is that you have a very old piece of law that obviously reflected the concern of a specific time, and then you have this technological revolution where you live in a society where speech is no longer scarce in any way, but overabundant, right? Again, that's the thing with recommendation algorithms and the attention of allocation. Speech is overabundant. Attention is scarce, right? So I think that we're doomed because of that to find ourselves asking practical questions that come from our experience of the digital public sphere that the First Amendment as a piece of legislation is not equipped to answer well. So, and then, that's the art or the difficulty of jurisprudence is constantly having to interpret those old clauses in ways that somehow is going to tell us something about the present. But it's very, very difficult. But, once I've said this, what do? We're going to get rid of the First Amendment, right? That's not going to happen. But we might need other kinds of legislation, but some of these legislations are going to be struck down because some people are going to argue that they're compatible with the First Amendment. So we're in a very tough legislative position, right? But I just think that the fundamental problem identified by Drew is right. I would have some things to say about why I think Roxana's perspective is also very important, but I'm afraid I'm speaking too much already.
Do we have other questions?
No, I think we're at the hour.
Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for being here, and thank you very much to our panelists who've really made for an interesting discussion here.